January 2006 was a troubled time. My oldest daughter didn't talk to me much. My youngest daughter still lived at home and had nothing but nasty words to say about men in general and me in particular. We could not have a conversation. My wife didn't need me, didn't want me, but didn't want to be bothered with getting rid of me. I was a graduate student at the University of Maryland, the lead writer on a group paper for the star of the statistics department, Bob Mislevy. I had done my part and was waiting for the editor, Kathy Haney, to do her work. I'm a pretty good writer and it didn't need much editing. She was slow, but she was fairly attractive and flirty, so I put up with it. The anthropology department announced another study abroad program like the one that had had me spend a month with the Indians in the Amazon. I jumped at the chance. I could afford a month off while waiting for Kathy. The topic of the course was the Jewish History of Argentina. On January 2nd, we assembled at the airport in Washington, D.C. Judith Friedenberg was the anthropologist leading the trip, her Argentine assistant Maru, and 11 students. 10 of them student age, 10 of them female, and me. All arrived on their own except for Devora, an Ethiopian girl, who was dropped off by her mother in classy traditional Ethiopian dress. From there we flew to Miami and then overnight to Buenos Aires. After a day's rest, we drove 15 hours, 1,300 kilometers, north to Posadas on the Argentine-Paraguay border. We picked up a guide, a local anthropologist named Victor, who told us the history of the town. The next day took us to the huge Ysireta Dam built with World Bank money, then on to a couple of old Jesuit missions and up to the spectacular Iguazu Falls. We spent a day in a German settlement where Judith and I waltzed and the American girls watched as the young people from the area went through their courtship rituals at a country dance. The women in our class were study in diversity. Tanjira, an Indian girl, Devora, the Ethiopian, and another supposed black, Robin, although both were lighter skinned than Tanjira, a couple of Asians, and Laura, a Jewish girl, and the rest plain old white women of one kind or another, and me. I got along well with most of these women, although to be honest, they weren't terribly impressive. They didn't know much about Argentina, anthropology, or life in general. Only a couple seemed interested and only half spoke acceptable Spanish. I got a lot more out of conversation with the bus drivers, Judith and Maru. Laura, the Jewish girl, just avoided me. God hadn't done much to make Laura attractive, but she seemed to go out of her way to make herself unattractive. She wore loose gray and brown clothing over her flabby body. But what I remember best is her shoes. We stayed in a 5-story hotel in Posadas. Her flip-flop beach shoes went slap, 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 very loudly all the way up and then all the way down 5 stories. I hate men, I hate men. She neither had nor seemed to want any feminine grace whatsoever. Now, after a week of touring, we headed south to the Jewish settlement of Villa Clara, the centerpiece of our journey. On our way to Villa Clara, Devora asked for my help with a Spanish language crossword. I moved to the back of the bus and sat down across the aisle. We worked on it for about 15 minutes. Then Laura, her seatmate, said rather pointedly that it smelled. I didn't smell anything. A couple of minutes later, she said she was claustrophobic. An odd statement. We continued with the crossword. 2 more minutes and she got to the point. Would I please leave? It was an odd request, but I did. A couple of days later, Devora and I were walking after dinner in the town of Villa Clara. Laura showed up and inserted herself into our conversation in a very direct and obnoxious way. After 3 of us walked together for about 10 minutes, Laura quite pointedly pulled Devora away and said she needed to talk with her alone. Her maneuver has a name, the cock block. Feminists preach that men are evil. They take it on themselves to prevent other women from being seduced by men, whether or not the other women want the protection. I might have been flattered that Laura would even consider a 63-year-old married man to be any sort of a threat to the young and pretty Devora. I just looked at it from an anthropologist's point of view. It was a weird tribal ritual of these young Americans. I might have wished she felt other women needed similar protection. 3 of us wound up staying with Negrita, an old Jewish woman, for our time in Villa Clara. The 2 black girls, Robin Devora, and me. Over breakfast, I offered the opinion that the situation was pretty good for black women. They had affirmative action preference on 2 counts, female and black. It was obvious that women are taking over the university. Just look at the students and the professors in this class. Robin was about 1.85 meters tall, slim and well-dressed, kind of like Michelle Obama. It had previously come out that Robin had graduated from Sidwell Friends, where Obama's kids were to go 2 years later, where I occasionally substitute taught and where my kids would not have had a prayer of getting in, white as they were. "Oh no," said Robin, "you just don't understand how much prejudice is out there. You don't know what it's like to be black." Well, this is an argument I can't fight. Of course I don't know what it's like to be black, or female, or gay, or many other things. On the other hand, neither could she come up with an example of any discrimination she'd faced. She just put on a hangdog look and repeated that there was no way I could know how bad it was being black and female. Devora, the immigrant, had only a few years' practice playing the victim. She wasn't even as convincing as Robin, but displayed solidarity of the sisterhood. She surely could not tell this white guy he was right. Hidden sexism and racism is part of the official dogma of the university. We continued to get along well, but I avoided that topic for the rest of the trip. On the last day of our trip, we took turns giving presentations on what the trip had meant to us and what we were doing in our studies. I gave a presentation on statistics. Most people don't know what it means. I said, in statistics, we take a proposition. Let's say, for instance, Laura's proposition that women students are hardworking and men students are lazy. How would we test that proposition? Laura immediately rose to say she had never said any such thing. However, sisterhood notwithstanding, all the women had been hearing the same anti-male message now for 2 weeks, and they didn't contradict me. I went on to describe how a statistician would devise some sort of a test or series of tests for laziness, how the test would demand some objective measure of laziness, how the test would have to be constructed not to be biased, how the test would have to be fairly administered and the results measured and then statistically analyzed, and then finally how far apart the male and female averages would have to be statistically significant, to be able to call men lazy. Laura was uncomfortable with the entire process, but the audience seemed to like the presentation and applauded me. We completed the course, hearing about how nasty the right-wing government had been in the 1980s. I had been in Argentina and didn't see it, and how the community-run socialist enterprises were thriving. Once the plane landed in Washington, we headed our separate directions and never saw each other again. Judith gave me an A in the course. When I asked Kathy about her progress in editing our paper at the University of Maryland, she attacked me for the terribly sexist email I'd sent. I was shocked. What did I say? Thinking she was somewhat sympathetic, I'd written that Devora dressed so everything that ought to jiggle, jiggled appropriately. That language is far too strong for a feminist to accept. She threatened to tell Bob Mislevy I was sexually harassing her and get me dismissed from the project. At this point, I knew I was not looking forward to a career in statistics. I didn't care, but I didn't want to fight, and I tolerated it as Kathy took her own sweet time to do essentially nothing in improving the paper. There was a disaster on the home front as well. My wife had found a receipt for a $2,500 gift I had bought for our 25th wedding anniversary. She saw that it could not be returned after the middle of January and panicked. She might not like it. In spite of the fact that our daughter Naomi had helped pick it out, and it came from her favorite jewelry store, and she had never not liked any jewelry I bought her before. So she had our youngest daughter Susie ransack all of my private things to see if she could find the present. Susie did not find the necklace, but she did find a shotgun. In America, we own guns for good reasons. I was in the Army and know how to use them. I was in the Black Riots and I know why. My wife, however, was horrified by any gun and couldn't talk about them rationally, and incredibly angry that I would even have one. That was the state of women in America in 2006, in high schools, college, the workplace, and the family. I concluded that either I was crazy or the United States was crazy. Our marriage took several more hits before I left 9 months later. I then decided to check out the world again. You know about my happy story here in Ukraine. I have concluded that I am sane, Ukraine is sane, but the United States is definitely crazy. Now, if you want to know about the Jewish history of Argentina, that's another